Hi guys, my name is Emily. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about Gossip from the Forest by Sara Maitland. So this is a piece of nonfiction that, as the title would suggest, is about forests, specifically forests around the UK. Maitland visits 12 forests across 12 months and looks at the ways in which the relationship between humans and forests is connected, how that has changed the way that forests are grown and shaped and preserved. And most importantly, she is looking at the connections between forest and fairy tales. And so at the end of each chapter, she's visited a forest, she's talked about how the forest looks, what sort of forestry practices have shaped the forest, what sort of jobs existed then and now, or don't exist anymore, and how she sees specifically the woods and the forest impacting fairy tales in very specific ways. She's also done a lot of academic research and looked at the sort of clinical, I guess, way that academics tend to look at the forest in fairy tales, or tend to look at fairy tales. She's to some degree critiquing like a Freudian reading of fairy tales and very much trying to root these stories back in the places that shape them, which are the forests. At the end of each chapter, she brings us back to fairy tales by doing a fairy tale retelling. And so I feel like it's only fit to share with you my favorite story from the collection, and I am going to read that for you now. And that is Little Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf. Once upon a time, there was a man who lived alone in the forest. He lived in the forest in a small cottage a long way up a rough track. He worked in the forest, tree felling, track filling, ditch digging, and deer killing. Power saw and rifle. On the whole, he worked alone, although, if there were tasks to be done requiring more than one worker, he would do his share, silently and without smiling. Once a week or so, he came down his rough track on his quad bike and went to the office to get his work schedule. He broadly followed his orders. No one could quite say that he did not do his job. His boss and his colleagues were uncomfortable around him. There was a faint shadow that fell when he arrived, and that evaporated in the sunshine of his departure. They did not like him, but they never teased or bullied him. He was strange and dangerous. Once a month or so, he came down his rough track in his Land Rover and went into the village and bought supplies. Tea bags, powdered milk, sugar, probably more biscuits and less fruit and vegetables than was good for him. He never bought meat, but then most of them didn't. Why pay for what you can kill for free? He looked at his feet, never received any post, and spoke to no one. Once a year, he would bring his quad and his Land Rover in for servicing. He would draw his equipment from the store as and when needed, never asking for any favors, never taking less than his due. In the winter, the smoke from his stove could sometimes be seen drifting from among the trees. Occasionally, especially when it was misty or very cold, someone would say in the pub of an evening that he had taken to coming out at night, prowling, spying, but someone else would tell the first someone not to be so bloody stupid and the conversation would drift off again. No one really cared enough to give a sharp, eager edge to the gossip. Once, maybe 3 years back, he had not come to the meeting, and he had not been to the village. People noticed. They always do. After a week or so, Ken and Davy were sent to check on him. They rode up roaring their quads, partly delighting in the day off, partly irritated, partly curious, and, although they would never have admitted it, partly scared. The cottage looked dark and shabby. They shouted a bit outside and finally bashed on the door. He came out looking dreadful, obviously ill, probably feverish, but he had his rifle in his hand and he cursed them, so they fled. Embarrassed by their fear, they told the officer he was sick but did not want any help. The next week he arrived at the meeting on time but did not thank the boys or the foreman. It was a life. He lived alone because he liked his own company and disliked the company of other people. He felt safe in the huge emptiness of the forest and its muttered comings and goings. He was at home in the wildness of it, the secrecy. Other people broke into those secrets and into the dark places in his guts. They gave him a fierce headache, which was hatred, although he did not know that. One night, late, almost midnight, with snow on the ground and a moon 4 or 5 days off the full, silvering the edges of heavy, fast-flying clouds, his phone rang. It was the emergency call. 3 rings, then silence. Then another 3 rings, and silence. After 4 rounds of that, he answered the phone, grunting his name. Could he get down quick? There was a lost child. The voice was almost apologetic. It was Ian's stag night, so most of the boys were away and probably drunk and hard to get a hold of. The voice did not quite say they were sorry they had to bother him, but it was implicit. He dressed quickly, took his torch, his rifle, his heavy boots, gloves, gaiters, balaclava, first aid kit, keys to the gate. It was part of the job, although he had never had to do it before. When he went outside, the cold caught his throat and he coughed. Then, standing still in the dark, he heard a high-pitched scream. It was not a child. It was a rabbit, taken probably by a fox. He knew it was important that he got down as quickly as possible before anyone started wondering where he was. But even in his haste, he noted the neat double footprints of the roe deer along the snow in the track. He preferred roe to the occasional big red deer that came down from the high moor. He liked the way their heart-shaped rumps flashed through the trees as they leapt away. Their meat was sweeter, and easier to manage, too. The bike slithered on the icy track, and the moon cast lumpy shadows, making it difficult to judge the best path. But he did hurry as much as he could. After a noisy while, he saw the yellow lights from the office and the white and red lights from the gathering cars. He swung his quad into the car park, circled once, and pulled up next to a blue pickup. As he switched the engine off, there was a sudden stillness between his legs. He knew. He knew absolutely what had happened, and he was both angry and frightened. In the shed they called the office, there was a lot of coming and going. He stood with his back against the wall and watched the hullabaloo. His boss was sitting at the desk looking worried. There were 4 policemen anxiously trying to get a decent signal. There were 3 walkers, rather elaborately kitted out. There were half a dozen folk from the village and a couple from the farms already, and there would be more of both soon as the word spread. There was a conspicuous shortage of forestry workers. Ian's stag night was taking place over 60 miles away. In a chair in the middle of the office, there was a hideous heap of blubber and peroxide blubbering. It was the child's grandmother. His headache thumped at the sight of her. He closed his eyes. It was all her fault. She was 10 years old, she was wearing her pink trainers and a red anorak. She'd been missing since about 2 o'clock, her grandmother thought. She had almost certainly not left the forest. Of course she would be all right, but frightened and very cold. They should find her. Not waiting till morning. His boss got up and pinned a map on the wall, took a felt-tip pen, started marking circles, looking at his motley and inadequate forces, trying to deploy them sensibly where there was little sense. He forced himself to speak through the thudding of his headache. He'd go up Carsfray, he said, up to the lock. Shouldn't he? He knew that best. She couldn't have walked that far, could she? Not if she was alone. If she were alone. The bulk of the grandmother wailed. The older of the policemen looked up sharply, glanced around, his eye pausing speculatively. He pushed himself stiffly off the wall. His boss nodded at him, relieved that someone was doing something vaguely useful. He took his quad up through the trees. Under their cover, the forest was very dark, infinite pools of blackness retreating uncowed before his headlights. After about 20 minutes riding, he stopped at the loch side. Out from under the trees, it was much brighter. Around the rough shore, the water was frozen, glistening in the moonlight, but out towards the middle of it was as black as the forest had been. The trees crawled up and around both sides of the water and then petered out. At the top end of the loch, it had proven too boggy even for plantation. The moon made enough light out there to see the shape of the hill line. Behind him, the trees moaned and creaked softly. He listened to the nothing of the night. Then he unstrapped the rifle, slid it out of its canvas tube, and loaded it. Carrying it broken over his forearm, he left the quad at the end of the track and very quietly turned and began to walk up the western edge of the loch. He knew where he was going. There was a small fall, frozen into silence now, and the channel curved away there and had carved out a peninsula of broken rock. Behind this was a rock overhang. There was its lair. 3 years ago, he had taken sick with fever. Early one morning, the 2 of them, a man all beard and thick glasses, a woman skinny with a steel peg in her lower lip and a wild intensity in her eyes, had come to his cottage. They told him they had stolen a wolf from the zoo and wanted to set it free. He would have told them to get lost. It was no concern of his. But Ken and Davy arrived, crashing, shouting, hefting his headache up. He signed to the 2 strangers to keep quiet and went out and ran the boys off. He came back into the cottage smiling. And then it was too late. He was committed. The 3 of them walked through the wood to the van. The wolf was in the back, mangy, desperate, sad. He could see the sadness deep in the green eyes that had stared without forgiveness, without kindness, without engagement. The beast was restless, turning and turning in the confines of the metal box. It was as lean and strong and fierce as his headache. It was pacing round and round, beautiful and wild. It was the fever, the madness of the fever, and the headache, and the green eyes, and the sadness. With crafty skill, he had lured the wolf out of the van and into the back of his Land Rover. Then he had taken the Land Rover up to the Carsfray and set the wolf loose. He had gone home to his bed and woken 2 days later uncertain if it were true or dream. It was true. Now as he crept at the loch side of the icy moonlight, he was fierce with rage. A stupid child, a little fat, spoiled poodle dragged into the forest by her foolish grandmother, ignorant, arrogant, flaunting her so-called sweetness, luring men to evil thoughts, tugging at his chest. Stupid old woman, fat and flubbery in the chair, wailing, "Stupid little girl who should have stayed in town and left him alone, left the beautiful wolf alone, free on the hillside, the wolf who hunted alone, who struggled against the world. Stupid little brat, stupid, stupid, dangerous idiots, pink sneakers, and a wretched whiny voice." But even in his rage he was silent. Slipping through the trees, careful, deft in the shadows, he found them. The little chubby girl with her clothes torn and her soft belly sticking out under her red jacket, terrified into stillness, petrified, unable to move or shout, was pressed up against a huge boulder left there by a passing glacier a very long time ago. She could not retreat any further, and she could not take her eyes off the wolf. The wolf was 3 meters away watching her, crouching, tail and belly low, perfectly attentive. In the moonlight he could see that it was scrawny, too thin and desperate with hunger and grief. The cape of hair on its shoulders, which should have been heavy and luxuriant, was thin and matted into rats. There was terror and sadness in it. He paused under the shadow of the last tree. He could see that at any moment the child's fear would break out and she would turn to run. She was too stupid and ignorant to know that wolves prefer to attack from behind. When she turned, it would pounce. He smiled, waiting and watching. Its claws would rip off the silly jacket, the weight of its leap would bowl her over, the fangs would sink into her flanks, and then, when she was down, into her neck. The wolf would be well fed for once, would slink back into the rocks around its cave, and lurk there until the winter was over and there was easier ground to prey. And it would live another wild season, free and beautiful, and he could go home to his bed, and no one would ever know. When he looked at the wolf, his headache eased. The wolf was beautiful. The wolf loved him because he had set it free. All he had to do was nothing. Just wait. She would crack, run, scream. The wolf would kill. Serve that little bitch right. That would teach them to avoid the forest and stick to the paths and leave him in peace, not come tormenting and tempting him. They would never know he had been here, that he had found her, that he had seen anything. But they would search until they found her bones. And then they would hunt the wolf. And there would be weeks of noise and coming and going and being and doing in the forest. And there would be no peace. No peace for the wolf, no peace for him. They were not free. They were not wild. He could sense the tension in the child and in the wolf. He waited as long as he could. He watched her as the wolf watched her. He knew she had not seen him, and she was ready to break. Then he snapped up the rifle barrel, raising it in a single movement. The noise made the wolf turn and stare straight at him. He saw its eyes filled with sadness. He shot it neatly in the dark space between the 2 green lights. This is what a woodcutter has to do when a little child is endangered by a wolf. He did not want to touch her. She made him sick. But he picked her up and carried her back through the trees to the quad. He lifted her onto the saddle and, swinging up behind her, settled her between his legs. He rode more slowly down than coming up. He did not speak a single word to her. He led the child in by her hand, offering no comfort. The office was still in a puddle of light. His boss was sitting at his desk with a phone in his hand. 1 policeman was standing by the door, his cap off and a clipboard in hand. The grandmother was still a lump of slobbery mess on the chair. Everyone else was in the forest. The grandmother started screaming, "Did he hurt you? What did he do to you? Did he? Are you?" The child started sniveling. His headache started thumping. After he had answered all their questions, they let him go. Dawn was breaking gray and grim. The moon had set. The outline of the trees was pulling away from the dark sky, coming towards him. It was terribly cold. He rode back up to Karsfrey and walked once more to where the Menzelburn cut down along the forest edge. The ground was frozen too hard for him to bury the wolf, so after a struggle he broke the ice and threw the body into the loch. Then he went home and hung himself. They did not find him for 11 days. He was the wolf. I loved this book. The stories are often modern takes, modern retellings, or a twist on a classic story that we are all so familiar with. And they're just so great. And reading this got me interested in fairy tales again. And so I have a quick little reading pile of fairy tale books that I am interested in reading that I will share with you now. very quickly. The Sisters of the Winter Wood by Rena Rossner. So this came up because of my interest in Naomi Novik's works, Spinning Silver and Uprooted, both of which are fairy tale inspired. I also have two YA retellings of Cinderella here, both of which have taken fairly different approaches. Ash by Melinda Lowe. So this is a queer Cinderella retelling, and one is Cinder by Marissa Meyer, and this is a future Cinderella retelling in which Cinderella is a cyborg, I believe. I also have a collection of poetry, and that is Fierce Fairy Tales, Poems and Stories to Stir Your Soul by Nikita Gill. I, of course, also have to go for the originals with the complete first edition of the original folk and fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm, translated and edited by Jack Sipes. Jack Sipes is a big name in like fairy tale academia. It's gonna be really interesting to keep in mind place and how place very much shapes these stories. I also have a book of Russian fairy tales. Again, this spurs off my interest in Naomi Novik's fairy tale retellings. So I wanted to see the roots of those fairy tales with a book of Russian fairy tales. Those are the fairy tale things that I'm interested in reading, especially now with Gossip from the Forest in mind, because so much of Gossip from the Forest was about locating these tales in place. Thinking through the ways in which human interaction with forest shapes the way the forest looks and functions, the way different forest environments result in different fungus and plants, and how those plants might appear to early people telling stories. So I think it will be interesting to think about all of the things that I've learned about forests and trees and all of these jobs, and like the ways in which humans before like industrial agriculture were very much tied to the forest. Like you would release your herds into the forest to graze. Just the ways in which the forest has been used by people, I think will be really interesting to have this stuff in mind as I think about and read fairy tales. Because it's true, the fairy tale is very much full of the forest, set in the forest. The forest is probably the most common setting. It's always there. People live on the edge of the forest. They wander into the forest. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Are you a fan of fairy tales? Are you a fan of fairy tale retellings? Do you have a favorite retelling specifically? If you liked what you saw here today, be sure to give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you again soon. Bye.